Welcome into episode number 106 of The Voice Behind the Voice. I'm Sean Aronson, the TV and radio broadcaster for the St. Paul Saints, an independent minor league baseball team in the Twin Cities. Well, we've reached kind of another milestone, if you will. It was March 24th of 2016 that I officially put out my very first episode, if you will. Now, it was just the intro episode. There was no interview to that. It was just me introducing you to what this podcast was going to be all about. So we have reached the 2-year mark of this podcast a couple of days ago now. 2 years that I've been doing this, where we've churned out an episode every single week, a brand new episode every single week for basically 104 weeks. And it's been pretty interesting and pretty entertaining. Everything from sitting down with the four major sports and the NCAA to letting you inside of the St. Paul Saints broadcast booth when I've had some guests in there, to even sitting down with the friend of mine that was the inspiration for this podcast. We've done it all. And we're going to continue to do this, as I've said before, as long as the guests continue to be interested in appearing on this podcast. And I'll say this much for the recent guests that I've interviewed that we'll unveil over the coming weeks. People are starting to know about this podcast. Broadcasters have started to listen to this podcast even before they've sat down with me, and so they kind of know what they're getting themselves into now that they're about to take a trip down memory lane about some events in their lives they probably haven't thought about in years. And that's kind of what I'm getting from the most recent people that I've sat down with. They've commented, and I haven't thought about this in a long time. And so it's making them go back through their memory banks to, remember what these stories were about. And a lot of them will turn to me and say, you know more about me than I do. And again, it goes back to the time and preparation that I put into this, but they've almost taken these moments and pushed them deep into the recesses of their mind. They've almost forgotten about them, and that's the point of this podcast, to bring out those stories that just aren't talked about very much. Speaking of stories, I had an incredible dinner on, this would have been Friday night. Pete Weber, the play-by-play broadcaster for the Nashville Predators, who I've had on this podcast, play-by-play broadcaster on the radio side, was in town, and he and I have kept in touch since I had him on the podcast, and he wanted to come see our ballpark. So he had reached out to me. He said, hey, we'd love to come by and check out the ballpark. So I picked him up, brought him over here about a mile away from where they stay, right across from the XL Energy Center over here, and walked him around, and then we went to dinner. We went to a place in town called Tom Reed's. Tom Reed, a former NHL player, now has a sports bar that is, about 0.3 of a mile from the XL Energy Center. And two things about this dinner. The first was I was introduced to Tom. It's the first time I've ever met him. And Pete introduced him as, introduced me as someone that works for the St. Paul Saints. And Tom said, what do you do for the Saints? And I said, well, I do the broadcast for the Saints. And he was sort of sheepish, kind of, I don't want to say embarrassed, but felt like he should have known that piece of information. I basically said, no, don't worry about it. I mean, there's no reason you should know that. And then we're sitting there. Now, again, I know Tom Reed is this guy that owns this bar, and I've known the name Tom Reed for a long time, but I didn't know. And I looked at him and I said, with you running this bar and having to be here all the time, do you ever get to go to a Wild game? And he looked at me and he said, well, I do the broadcast for the Wild. He is the analyst on the radio side with Bob Kurtz, who I've also had on this podcast. And I looked and I said, I'm extremely embarrassed that I didn't know that. I don't listen to Wild games, though. I mean, I'm a Kings fan. If I ever watch a Wild game, it's going to be on TV. I don't usually tune in on the radio. And for some reason, I didn't know this piece of information. Now, maybe I did, and it wasn't at the top of my mind. But he looks at me and he's like, well, nobody knows me either. So we had a good laugh about that. But the second thing was the stories just sitting there and listening to Pete and listening to Tom talk about their time in the NHL. Pete is a broadcaster, Tom is a broadcaster and as a player, and just sitting back and listening to those two guys talk. I'm going to let you in on a little something that I'm hoping to get done in 2019. And this is sort of an idea that has been taken from the New York market that happened one time. I would like to hold let's call it a hot stove banquet, even though it wouldn't be necessarily that, although it would probably be right around that time in February, where I could get all the play-by-play broadcasters in the state of Minnesota, invite them into one room, and do like a dinner, sell tickets, for this dinner, and allow them to just tell stories and to talk about their time in their respective sports and have fans, ask questions. I think that if we did it here at the ballpark in our club area that seats about 200, 250, we'd sell it out in moments. That's my idea. I had pitched it this year, but we didn't have enough time to try and get it done. You got to find a day that everybody's available. I haven't even brought it up to the broadcasters yet. I brought it up internally here. But in 2019, that is going to be my goal, to get that done, and I think people would love to see it. And I think in whatever market you might be in, I think it would be a great idea in each and every market. So that's just my thought. With that, let's get to episode 106. It is Neil Funk of the Chicago Bulls. Now, speaking of guys that have stories, we talked about the Jordan days for a little bit. We talked about how his career and Bob Costas' career could have been very, very different, as the two of those guys went for the same job in the city of St. Louis. And he tells that good story about being a finalist and having the job go to Bob Costas, a guy, as he said, I didn't know who Bob Costas was. Back then, nobody knew who Bob Costas was. So this is going to be a fun ride down memory lane with Neil. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you can do so on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. And again, be sure to follow us on social media, Facebook, facebook.com/TheVoiceBTV, Twitter @TheVoiceBTV, and you can always email me, thevoicebtv@gmail.com. Let's get to it. Episode number 106 with Neil Funk of the Chicago Bulls. JW, roll the open.
We're going to fly you down to St. Louis to meet with the people at KMOX, who at that time were the number one CBS affiliate in the country. So I was kind of thinking, well, I got a chance to get this job. I had no idea that Costas was the other guy, and I had no idea who Bob Costas was,
Sure.
even though he had been at Syracuse.